we will give you a brief introduction to the Global Biodata Coalition. I will do that, and then Rachel will talk about the Core Biodata Resources selection process. So with that, let's get started. I have the next slide. So biodata resources, as most of you no doubt are aware, have a long history of data sharing. We have some examples on the right of some older forms of sharing data using paper. They archive primary life sciences research data, and there are specialist repositories as well. There are also added value curation knowledge bases that analyze the primary data. Most of you are probably well aware of that. There's extensive collaboration and data exchange between resources, and there are thousands of resources, which we will talk about very briefly later. Next slide. Biodata resources form a crucial distributed global infrastructure. And by distributed, we mean that they are physically located, managed by, and supported by funders and scientists around the world. They're also used by scientists around the world. They're essential, they're fundamental for all life sciences research and increasingly for medicine. And they're cost effective. Spending to preserve research data and to provide added value analysis of those data is certainly much less expensive than regenerating data de novo for every new experiment. Next slide. Who pays for biodata resources? Many of the larger resources are paid for by national and charitable research funders through grant funding. Often smaller research resources or resources that are being started up are paid for by academic institutions, usually to the PI that is starting the resource. Major institutions, and by that we mean NCBI in the US, MBI in Europe, the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics, are also funded by these funders here, and there probably are others that are on this list. Next one. Challenges to the infrastructure, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There's more and more data being generated, which puts pressure on the storage for deposition resources. Open access policies also increase demand by putting more pressure on the resources, and new technologies create demand for new kinds of resources. Funding has been haphazard, short-term, and is somewhat unsystematically distributed. And crucially, there's not a lot of coordination among funders of these resources around the world. This leaves room for more efficient collaboration between the funders, and that's what the Global Biodata Coalition is about. Next slide. So the need for coordination of funding has been known for quite some time, recognized by funders for quite some time. This paper in 2015 stated explicitly or described explicitly the problem and called for creation of a coalition of funders to address the issue. Phil Bourne, the first author here, is on the webinar tonight, so thanks for joining, Phil. This resulted in a series of meetings over the next few years and the creation of the Global Biodata Coalition. The other papers here are an early publication from the coalition before, in fact, we had a name describing what we intended to do. Next page, next slide. Establishing the coalition, here's just a short timeline to tell you what we've been doing. The paper in Nature was in 2015. Of course, this issue was in the minds of funders far before that. Other key dates here: 2017, we established a steering group to help put things together. I have a and in 2020, we initiated our scientific program, and this year we've started the Global Core Biodata Resources selection process, which you're describing here. This is the homepage of the GBC, and here's our stated aims, and I'll let you read these later. So can we go to the next slide? Current members and observers of the Board of Funders. Members are funders who've signed the letter of agreement and have agreed to make annual contributions to support the GBC. Observers are funders who are interested but haven't been able to agree yet, and we hope they will convert to become full members in the near future. And I should say that the funding membership contributions are very small, and they just support the secretariat, which is represented on this webinar. It's not money to support data resources. It's money to support the GBC's function or operations. Next slide. The GBC work program at the moment has 3 components, or 2 components, one of which has 2 facets. Describing the biodata infrastructure. So I've just said that there's a distributed infrastructure of biodata resources. It's not well described. We don't really know how many resources there are. We don't know what's out there. We don't know where they are. We don't know who all of them are funded by. We don't know how much money is spent. We'd like to know the answers to all of those questions. Of course, we know some of it, but we don't know all of it. And we're addressing, in the first instance, an inventory of the resources. In other words, how many are out there. We are selecting Global Core Biodata Resources, which we'll talk about more in the rest of this webinar. And we've also established working groups among the funders who are on the board for knowledge exchange. The first 2 working groups are addressing open data policies and sustainability of the resource of the infrastructure. So those are 2 big questions. We have the first meetings of those this week and next. So we hope to be able to report something interesting in a few months or a year or so. Next slide. So now the rest of this is about core biodata resources. What are they? They're deposition or knowledge bases that are of fundamental importance to the life science community, and they provide complete collections of generic value to life science and show high levels of usage, scientific quality, and service. That's a bit that's a really nice description, and we're going to tell you later how we're going about selecting. The concept of core data resources was pioneered by Elixir in Europe. Many of you will be familiar with that. And the image on the right just shows some of the Elixir core data resources. Next slide. Why focus on these? Well, they're fundamental. Core biodata resources are fundamental for the entire infrastructure by definition. And we view them as being analogous to keystone species in an ecosystem, so that focusing on the core biodata resources will help understand and protect the entire ecosystem of resources globally. The next slide. Defining GCBRs will provide benefits to researchers, funders, and funding agencies and others. So for researchers, selecting repositories will allow them to comply with funders and publishers' open data requirements, and GCBR status will provide confidence in their choices. For funding agencies and science publishers, the availability of a recognized list of resources will help them recommend suitable repositories and reliable sources of information for the scientists they support. In individual funding agencies, the GCBRs will be helpful in helping them define criteria that characterize good insight into the established resource ecosystem. Next slide. For data resources, GCBRs provide examples of good practice that they can emulate. Data resources that are GCBRs that are selected, the GCBR community will provide opportunities to share expertise. and explore solutions to the challenge posed by funding. So we anticipate that the GCBRs will, well, we've stated clearly in the process that the GCBRs will be expected to contribute to these community building exercises and help the funders to develop ways to sustain the infrastructure. And we don't mean sustain only GCBRs, we mean to help sustain the whole infrastructure. For all stakeholders, open data stimulates research and drives data reuse and discovery. So working towards GCBR status inspires and serves as examples for data resources to provide more open data and to ensure that they have good open data licensing. Next slide. Right, so this is where I turn over to Rachel, and she'll go into a little bit more detail about GCBRs themselves and then explain the application process. So Rachel.
Thank you, Chuck. So Chuck's given you the background to the Global Biodata Coalition and introduced why, excuse me, why we're interested in defining this set of global core biodata resources. A couple of slides ago, you saw that core biodata resources are of fundamental importance to the wider biological and life sciences community and the long-term preservation of biological data. They also show high levels of usage, scientific quality and service. And so in this next section, we're going to talk about how we would recognize a global core biodata resource. In those statements quoted at the top of this slide, included in those concepts are that these core biodata resources provide free and open access to their data. They're necessarily used extensively, both in terms of the number and distribution of their users. They're necessarily mature and comprehensive. They're considered authoritative in their field. They are of high scientific quality and provide a professional standard of service delivery. So we're starting to enumerate their characteristics in a way that we could form a profile of them. We use indicators to frame this assessment. Indicators can be either quantitative, for example, usage statistics, and qualitative, where things are described with text. And the qualitative ones are important because not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. The indicators are therefore used, both the quantitative and qualitative ones are brought together and assessed in a peer review process. And the peer reviewers bring expert judgment to the assessment of these characteristics. And there are 5 categories of indicators, and I'll go through them each, but the 5 categories are scientific focus and quality of science, the community served by the resource, the quality of service, as opposed to the quality of science, this is the quality of service, the funding, governance and legal infrastructure. And this is important because core biodata resources need to be on very firm footing so they can provide good service in the long term. And then importantly, the 5th category of indicators deals with impact. We'll look at them one at a time. For each category, there are several subcategories. And I'll say now, we have included URLs to the source to the primary reference for each of these things as you go through these slides. So don't worry about trying to catch any of the detail. The slides will be made available afterwards, and all of this is out there in the public domain now for you to look up. So category 1, the subcategories describe whether the data resource is a deposition database or a knowledge base. There's a description of the scope of the information within the data resource. There is a section about the global dimension in terms of the operation of the resource and the users and contributors that use it and send information to it. And there's also a description of the staff effort and how that plays out over the years. The second category, community, has subcategories that deal with usage stats. So that's quantitative data, number of users, number of visits, number of hits. There is also, in another dimension, community measured as by way of who cites the data resource, either citing the data resource via its name or via its unique identifier pattern. We ask also in this category of indicator about the degree of citation of key publications describing the data resource. So, for example, you may be familiar with the nucleic acid research database issue. The data resource may publish in that, and if they do, how often are those papers cited or equivalent from other publications? We also include in this category connections to other data resources. This is the concept of the ecosystem, and data resources that are likely to be core biodata resources are likely to have very good data exchange relationships or data cross-reference relationships with other data resources, because that is a measure of how useful they are. Included within this category is a section in the quantitative data on global usage. This is new to the global selection process, and so that is quantitative data, number of countries that are accessing the data resource, the degree to which the data resource is used internationally. The third category of indicators, quality of service, is the most technical one, and includes identifier use, data volume, technical performance, importantly, use of standards. This is controlled vocabularies, ontologies, and the standards by which those are implemented. Documentation of data curation practices. Also provenance and evidence for the data statements that are within the data resource, and quality assurance. Then data availability, reuse of data is extremely important. So what data sharing services does the resource offer, and what formats is the data offered in via those sharing services? And then extremely important, the user support in 5 ways: help desk, user feedback, training, communications, and we also want to know about the languages in which the data resource is made available. So that's all your service, reliability, and technical performance, metadata standards are all covered in category 3. Category 4 is funding, governance, and legal structure, funding history, projection, as a measure of as a measure of the capacity of the data resource to argue for its continued support. The scientific advisory board is important. That's about maturity of governance. Data preservation, it's very important to have a data preservation strategy. The licensing, open science, we gather information about the type of license that the data is made available under. There are several kinds of compliant open licenses, and so we ask for that information in 4D. And then privacy policy and ethics policy, covering privacy and ethics of both the users of the data resource and the data that's within it, where that is relevant. Finally, the impact stories. This is the category of indicators where the data resources can express the role they've played in accelerating science, in bringing together ideas, information, access to both of those, such that the progress of science is potentiated as part of that. And then another way of asking that question is to say, what would happen were the data resource not to be there? What would be the impact on the biodata landscape and on the users who depend on this data resource? So that's textual information, impact stories, and that's the opportunity to describe how the biodata resource is indispensable to the biodata resource landscape. Now, all of those 23 indicators are listed in the primary publication that we published in January, which I'll tell you about a little bit more later. And there's links to that publication at the end of this presentation. So now you have an idea of the indicators that are used to describe core biodata resources, and it will be no surprise that we use those indicators in the Global Core Biodata Resource selection process. This process was launched in January of this year with a news announcement. We published the article, which is called Global Core Biodata Resources Concept and Selection Process, on Zenodo, the open publication platform, on that day. And we added 2 web pages to the Global Biodata Coalition website for the selection process, and announced that we'll be accepting expressions of interest from the 21st of March. Now, the selection process is going to unfold in 2 stages. The first stage is the expressions of interest, open for submission 21st of March until the 22nd of April. That is a high-level application form and includes 3 sections, which I'll go into in a moment: description, eligibility criteria, and short answer questions. After the expressions of interest have been submitted, they will be reviewed. We have a review committee, and each expression of interest will receive multiple reviews. And then when all the primary reviews are in, a review committee will sort through those and decide which applicants will be invited to the full application stage. There will then be the second stage of the process, which is the full applications. In the expression of interest, everything we ask is related to the indicators. In the full application stage, the detailed questions go through all 23 indicators, detail by detail. When the full applications have been submitted, they will be reviewed by the reviewers, multiple reviewers for each application, and then the review committee will decide which of those they recommend to be included in the initial list of the Global Core Biodata Resources, and that recommendation will be sent to the board of the Global Biodata Coalition Board of Funders for their formal final decision. Why are we using a 2-stage process? This is related to how best to achieve what we want to achieve without disrupting the global biodata landscape any more than it needs to be disrupted. To make its case, the Global Biodata Coalition does not need to consider all the biodata resources that are out there. As we've said, there are thousands. We don't know exactly how many, but we know there are several thousands at least of biodata resources. We don't need to make the case for proper sustainable support for the biodata ecosystem by studying every single one of those, nor can we. So we want to focus the impact of the Global Biodata Coalition's work in terms of its mission, strategy, and vision. The applicants in this process will typically be the managers of the data resources. They are very busy managing their data resources. And so we don't want to load a lot of unnecessary detail onto a great many biodata resources at the first stage. There will necessarily be a high degree of filtering and selection as we build this initial list of global biodata, core biodata resources. So we don't want to use up people's time by accepting a very high number of full applications from resources that are not likely to survive the full application process. So we use the expression of interest stage to filter and set expectations for the applicants. Similarly, the reviewers have a big job on their hands. First of all, there will be the expression of interest, which will be high level from the applicant's point of view, but there will likely be a very great many of them. And then secondly, at the full application stage, there will be a smaller number of applications, but a great deal more detail. So being a reviewer on this is not a small task, and we want to use their effort in the best way possible. And so we want to be able to focus their effort onto the full application, having made sensible decisions at the expression of interest stage. The next few slides will tell you about the expression of interest. Falls into 3 sections. The first is a description of the biodata resource. The first question is about how it falls within scope, with a short description of what the biodata resource is, what the data is it serves. We need a statement about whether it's a deposition database or a knowledge base. That's not selective, it's just useful to know because it frames the way we interpret the rest of the application. And then thirdly, in this introductory section, we would like a statement about the context in which the application is being made. This doesn't apply to all biodata resources, but there are biodata resources that function both independently and as part of a bigger consortium. For those data resources, they will need to make a decision about how they best want to make their application. And therefore, we ask that they explain that in this section 1, so we can understand what unit of application it is that we're looking at. The second section in the expression of interest is the eligibility criteria. There are 10 questions, and these are yes/no questions regarding data resource maturity and stability, metadata and standards, open data policy. The point of the eligibility criteria is to set expectations for the applicants. If they're not able to answer the eligibility criteria with a yes question, with a yes answer, they're probably not going to qualify for all of the in all of the indicators in the full application. Here are some examples. Question 2, is the resource able to provide usage statistics covering the scale of users and a statement of geographic distribution? They need to be able to do that if they're going to proceed to a full application. Does the data resource make its data available in a variety of formats? The answer to that is going to have to be yes if they're going to qualify as a core biodata resource. And then the third one example here is to do with the open data. So you can see from these examples how these are expectation setting and provide a benchmark for the suitability of the data resource to go forward. The third section of the expression of interest is short answer questions, and there are 5 questions that relate to the alignment of the data resource with the goals of the Global Biodata Coalition and the characteristics of the resource that qualify it to be a global core biodata resource. And each of these questions will be assessed in terms of how well they indicate that the biodata resource is suitable to progress to a full application stage. These are the short answer questions. I won't go through them now, but you'll have these slides afterwards for reference, and this information is in the associated materials. How do you go about submitting an expression of interest? This screenshot is taken from the web page that is indicated at the bottom. As you can see, the bottom panel says the submission system link will be added here when the application process opens. This is true. The interval for applications is March 21st until April 22nd. So you can see that third bullet will go live with the submission system entry point on March 21st. So that you can prepare in advance, the 2 boxes above, the expression of interest data required and the full application data required, those link to the supplementary data files which describe point by point what the questions are in the expression of interest stage and the full application stage. So you have that information in advance and have plenty of time to prepare. The submission system is very easy to use and can be paused halfway through. You're also able to have multiple contributors working on the same application, which can be extremely handy. And so that's how you'll know when the submissions can come in. You will be interested in the review process. It's operationally similar to that used by funding agencies for research proposals. Applications, multiple reviews, review committee. The reviewers are the Global Biodata Coalition Scientific Advisory Committee, enhanced by a large number of biodata resource experts. And I'll say, while we've got you here, and it says in the literature too, the reviewers do not include the Global Biodata Coalition Secretariat. So Chuck, David and I that are on this call serve in an administrative and support capacity in this process. We do not have any decision-making powers, and we can be used as sources of information about the process. And we hope that you will feel free to contact the GBC to ask us questions if you have further questions. We take confidentiality and conflict of interest extremely seriously. Some of the information that we request, particularly at the full application stage, is information that is not necessarily made publicly available by data resources, and people would regard as potentially sensitive information about staff numbers, funding, usage stats. We take all of that extremely seriously, and we expect the reviewers to. So when they are brought on board, they sign a confidentiality statement that alerts them to all of those factors. Conflict of interest. The biodata resource community is collaborative, and therefore we must be very aware of where there are potential conflicts of interest. The reviewers sign a conflict of interest declaration as they come on board, and then also in association with each review that they're asked to generate. We have two tiers of conflict of interest: a set of statements where there is definitely conflict of interest, and then another set of statements where there may be conflict of interest, and we ask the reviewers to alert us in either case, and so we can reconsider the assignment of any review that might be problematic for whatever reason. Timeline, here we are on the second line, webinar week at the Global Biodata Coalition. The submission of expression of interest opens on the 21st of March. The deadline is the 22nd of April. The review committee, working with the reviews generated in between the 22nd of April and the 23rd of May, will meet to determine which data resources will be invited to proceed to full application, and the notifications will come out during the week of the 13th of June. We have the full application timeline. A month later, in July, there will be a teleconference Q&A for those data resources invited to submit a formal full application. Then there's a submission window, July to August, review, and then the review process kicks off with a full application review committee meeting in September. And then by the time the board has approved the decision, it will be probably the final quarter of 2022. For the full application, these times are to be confirmed because given the experience that we've had in the past, it is possible that questions will be raised that we don't anticipate, and we may need to push these dates back as we deal with those, particularly if they have to go to the steering group. Okay. I promised that you'd be given all the references. Here they are. The top one is the primary publication, the Global Core Biodata Resources Concept and Selection Process. There's the link to it on Zenodo. The two supplementary data files, data required for expression of interest and full application, are associated with that primary publication. The GBCR selection webpage. We also have a FAQ, which is being updated as questions come in as a consequence of things like this webinar. And the slides will be deposited in the Global Biodata Coalition Zenodo channel when these webinars are concluded. We'll choose the one that is the clearest. No, we will put the slides on the Zenodo channel, and we're also making a YouTube channel where we'll put the recording of the webinar that is the clearest, and that will be there for future reference. For questions and clarifications, we have an email address about the GCBR selection process, and for general communications with the Global Biodata Coalition, the email address is the info@globalbiodata.org. It won't surprise you to know that Chuck oversees the second one of those, and we all look at the selection question one, so any questions that you have sent to those email addresses will come to us. And we encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and that's the end of the formal presentation.